It was a bright Saturday morning, the kind of day that carried a calm silence in the neighborhood. Birds sat on fences and sang their songs, and the sunlight touched the rooftops with a soft golden glow. Children had not yet come outside to play, and the street felt unusually still. In the middle of this quiet, a man stepped out of his house for his usual morning walk. His name was Marcus, a man who had spent years serving his community as a police officer. On duty, he was known for his discipline and bravery, but on this morning, he was simply himself, an off-duty officer enjoying the peace of his own neighborhood. Marcus wore a simple t-shirt and a pair of jeans. He carried a cup of coffee in one hand and kept his service weapon holstered at his side, as he always did. It was a part of him, not only because of the job but because it was his responsibility to be prepared. Carrying the weapon was not an act of pride or show, but simply a duty that he never ignored. He took slow steps along the sidewalk, listening to the sound of his shoes brushing against the concrete. The neighborhood was a mix of families, retirees, and new homeowners, the kind of place where people expected order and comfort. But Marcus, even after living there for some time, often felt eyes watching him. He knew that being one of the few black men in a quiet suburban neighborhood carried its own weight. Still, he chose to live there because it was safe, close to work, and gave him space to breathe after long shifts at the station. On this morning, Marcus was not thinking about work. He was thinking about his daughter, who had a piano recital later that day. He thought about whether she would be nervous, about how he would clap the loudest when she finished her piece. He smiled softly, sipping his coffee, lost in thoughts of family and the life he had built with years of dedication. From across the street, behind a tall hedge, a pair of eyes followed him. A woman stood on her porch, phone in hand. Her name was Linda, a member of the Homeowners Association, known to many as someone who often complained about small things: lawns that were too long, cars parked too close to mailboxes, or children making noise in the evening. She believed she was protecting the neighborhood's rules, but most saw her as someone who watched too closely, always ready to judge. When she noticed Marcus walking with something on his side, her mind filled with suspicion. She did not think about who he might be, or that he might live there. She did not consider that he could be someone trained and responsible. Instead, her thoughts jumped to fear. To her, a black man with a gun was not a neighbor, it was a threat. Marcus stopped for a moment, crouched down, and adjusted his shoelace. From where Linda stood, the movement looked suspicious. Her heart beat faster. She whispered to herself, "What is he doing with that gun out here?" The fact that he carried it legally never entered her imagination. Without taking a step closer, without speaking a word to him, she pressed the numbers on her phone and called 911. Her voice shook as she told the operator that there was an armed black man walking in the neighborhood. She gave his location and described his clothing, her tone filled with urgency, as if danger were seconds away. Marcus, on the other hand, remained unaware. He finished tying his lace, took another sip of coffee, and continued his walk. He thought about calling his wife to remind her about the recital time, but decided to enjoy the quiet a little longer before the day grew busy. A few houses down, blinds moved slightly. Another neighbor had heard Linda speaking loudly on the phone. Word spread quickly in quiet neighborhoods, sometimes without even saying much. People peeked out from windows, curious about what was happening. To them, Marcus looked calm and normal. But the sight of flashing lights or rushing police cars would soon change that calm into tension. Back at the 911 center, the call had already been flagged as urgent. An armed subject in a residential area meant possible danger, and officers were dispatched immediately. The information was sent over the radio: a black male, armed, walking near Elmwood Drive. Patrol cars turned their sirens on, cutting through the morning silence. Marcus was now nearing the small park at the corner of the street. He breathed in the fresh air, appreciating the smell of grass after the sprinklers had run. He thought about how this little park was one of the reasons he loved the neighborhood. Families gathered here, children played, and sometimes he even jogged in the evenings when his shifts ended early. Unaware of the call made against him, Marcus felt at peace. He nodded politely at an older couple who drove past slowly, though their nervous glance made him wonder for a brief second if something was wrong. But he brushed it aside. After years in the police force, he had learned not to assume too quickly. Meanwhile, Linda remained on her porch, watching like a guard. She held her phone tightly, feeling proud that she had acted in time. In her mind, she had prevented danger from touching her community. She did not think of Marcus as a father heading to his daughter's recital later, or as a neighbor who had just wanted a walk. To her, he was simply someone who didn't belong. The air began to change. From far away, Marcus heard the faint wail of sirens. At first, he thought little of it. Sirens were part of his world, always echoing somewhere in the city. But as they grew louder and closer, he realized they were heading straight toward his street. He turned slightly, puzzled, his brow furrowing. Police cars entered the neighborhood at high speed. Tires screeched, and the quiet Saturday morning turned into a scene of flashing lights and rushing engines. Doors swung open, and officers jumped out, scanning the area. Marcus froze for a moment, coffee cup still in his hand. He had seen the scene countless times but never from this side. In his heart, he knew what had happened. Someone had called him in. The peaceful morning he had begun with had already changed, even before anyone spoke a word. The sound of sirens echoed louder and louder as the police cars drew closer. Birds that had been calmly resting on tree branches scattered into the sky, startled by the sudden noise. The calm of the neighborhood vanished in seconds, replaced by the sharp hum of engines and the flashing beams of red and blue lights. Inside the patrol cars, officers were already on alert. The radio call had come through as urgent: armed subject, black male, wearing casual clothes, reported on Elmwood Drive. Possible threat. Proceed with caution. To them, this meant they could be arriving at a dangerous situation. They tightened their grip on the wheel, eyes scanning every corner as the car sped toward the street. Marcus, who had been taking his peaceful walk just moments earlier, now stood frozen on the sidewalk. He had lived through countless moments of emergency responses during his years as an officer, but this was different. This time, he wasn't in uniform, he wasn't behind the wheel of a patrol car, and he wasn't responding to a call. This time, he was the call. He looked down at himself: plain t-shirt, jeans, cup of coffee in his hand, badge in his wallet, and his service weapon holstered at his side. He knew instantly what the problem was. Someone had seen him with his firearm and called it in. And from the sound of the sirens, the call had been treated as high priority. At that moment, Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of him was frustrated. This was his neighborhood, his right to carry as a trained officer, his morning walk. But another part of him felt something deeper: disappointment. He thought about how quickly someone had chosen fear over understanding, and how fast assumptions had turned into danger. Across the street, Linda still stood on her porch, clutching her phone. She had not expected such a fast response. Her heart raced, but there was also a sense of satisfaction in her expression, as though she believed her quick thinking had saved the neighborhood. She watched eagerly, convinced that the man she had reported would soon be confronted and handled. The first patrol car screeched to a stop near the corner. Two officers jumped out, their eyes sharp, scanning for the reported suspect. Marcus stood calmly, his posture relaxed, but the weapon at his side immediately caught their attention. From their training, they knew they had to act carefully but quickly. An unknown man with a gun in a residential neighborhood could mean danger. They moved closer, hands hovering near their holsters, their voices ready to command. Marcus, seeing them, raised his free hand slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. He had been on the other side of this too many times to know what could happen if he made even the smallest sudden motion. His heart beat steadily, not from fear but from focus. He wanted to make sure this ended without harm for himself, for the officers, and for anyone watching. Behind curtains and blinds, neighbors watched silently. Some whispered to each other, some held their breath, and others recorded on their phones. The scene had transformed their quiet morning into something dramatic, almost unreal. Meanwhile, dispatch continued to update the officers. More patrol cars were on the way. In less than a minute, the street would be filled with flashing lights. All of this because of a single phone call. Marcus thought of his daughter again. He pictured her small smile when she played the piano, the way she sometimes looked up at him for courage. He thought about how today was supposed to be special for her, not a day marked by tension and misunderstanding. He knew he had to stay calm, no matter what. The officers approached, their voices firm but controlled. "Sir, we need you to keep your hands where we can see them." Marcus nodded slowly. "I understand," he said, his voice steady. "I'm one of you." The officers exchanged quick glances but did not lower their guard yet. Many times, suspects had claimed to be something they weren't. They had to see proof. Marcus took a slow breath. "My badge is in my wallet, left pocket. I'm going to reach for it slowly." The officers gave a cautious nod, their hands still ready. Every second felt heavy, stretched out by the weight of possibility. Marcus carefully set his coffee cup on the ground, then, with his right hand still raised, used his left hand to slowly reach into his pocket. The movement was smooth and deliberate, leaving no room for misunderstanding. When he pulled out the leather wallet and flipped it open, the shiny badge caught the sunlight. It glimmered, reflecting not just his authority but the years he had spent serving the same city that now doubted him. The officers froze for a moment, eyes locked on the badge. Their expressions shifted from tension to recognition. Relief washed across their faces as they quickly understood the truth: this was not a threat, not a suspect, this was one of their own. Still, the moment had carried a weight that could not be erased. For nearly a minute, Marcus had stood as a stranger in the eyes of his fellow officers. For nearly a minute, the wrong assumption had placed him at risk in his own neighborhood. Across the street, Linda's proud expression faded into confusion. She tilted her head, trying to understand why the officers now looked more relaxed, why they weren't rushing to handcuff him or order him to the ground. From her porch, she couldn't see the badge clearly, but she sensed the change. Her lips tightened as embarrassment replaced her earlier satisfaction. More patrol cars arrived, adding to the flashing lights. Officers stepped out, ready to act, but were quickly briefed by their colleagues: "It's okay, he's one of us." The words carried both relief and a quiet shame that they had almost treated a fellow officer as a suspect simply because of a call and a description. Marcus stood silently, letting them process. He didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to lecture anyone in that moment. He simply let the truth speak for itself. His badge was proof, but so was the calm way he had handled himself. The neighborhood, however, would remember more than just the badge. They would remember the sight of police rushing in, the tension that filled the air, the way a peaceful walk had turned into a spectacle. And they would remember how quickly the story changed when the truth came out. Marcus finally picked up his coffee again, the cup now cooler than before. He gave a small nod to the officers, a gesture of respect but also a quiet reminder: "This is what I live with." The officers, realizing the weight of the situation, began to lower their guard completely. Some offered brief apologies, others simply nodded in understanding. But the truth was, the moment had already spoken louder than words. The 911 call that had begun with suspicion had now turned into a lesson about perception, assumptions, and the dangers of quick judgment. For Marcus, it was a reminder of how fragile peace could be, even in his own neighborhood. And as the last echoes of sirens faded, and as neighbors slowly retreated back into their homes, the street carried a silence again. But it was not the same silence as before. This silence was heavier, filled with unspoken questions and quiet reflection. Marcus continued his walk, slower now, his thoughts deeper. He knew the story wasn't over. What had just happened was only the beginning of a larger conversation, one about fear, bias, and respect. And he knew, in his heart, that what came next would matter even more. White heavy check mark. That's the expanded part 2, about 1,300 words worth of pacing, in engaging, simple English. The flashing lights grew brighter as more police cars lined the street. The once peaceful neighborhood now looked like the scene of a crime show. Neighbors peeked out from their windows, some holding their phones, others whispering quietly behind curtains. The quiet Saturday morning had become something that would be remembered for years. Marcus stood still on the sidewalk, his coffee cup balanced in one hand, his badge still visible in the other. He had already shown the officers who he was, but the tension in the air hadn't fully disappeared. Every sound seemed louder: the hum of car engines, the faint crackle of radios, even the barking of a dog down the street. It was a moment suspended between misunderstanding and clarity. The two first officers, who had rushed in with urgency, now stood more relaxed, though their eyes still carried a mixture of relief and awkwardness. They had expected an armed threat, but instead, they had found one of their own. The realization weighed heavily on them. They exchanged quiet words, explaining quickly to the newer arrivals, "He's a cop. He lives here." Marcus nodded slightly, as if to confirm. His calm demeanor only made the scene more striking. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue, didn't display anger. Instead, he held himself with quiet authority, a man who understood how close things had come to turning into something dangerous. One of the newer officers, a younger man who had just joined the force a year ago, approached carefully. "Sir, we received a call about a man with a gun." "We didn't know," his words trailed off, almost like he didn't know how to finish the sentence. Marcus gave him a steady look. "I know what the call said," he replied gently. "I also know how fast these things can go wrong. That's why I showed my badge right away." The younger officer nodded, his face showing both respect and discomfort. He had probably imagined many dangerous encounters during his training, but he hadn't imagined nearly pointing his weapon at someone who wore the same badge as him. Across the street, Linda remained on her porch, her face pale. The scene had not played out the way she imagined. She had expected the man she reported to be taken away, perhaps even scolded for carrying a firearm. Instead, she watched as the officers stood with him in respect. Her neighbors, too, began to notice the truth. Whispers turned into quiet conversations. "That's Marcus, isn't he a cop? He lives right down the street." The story she had believed in of a dangerous stranger was already unraveling before her eyes. As the seconds ticked by, Marcus decided to take a slow step forward. He knew it was important to control the atmosphere. Every movement had to be calm, steady, and reassuring. He set his coffee cup on the hood of one of the patrol cars and kept his voice even. "I'm Marcus. I serve in the city department. Off duty today, just taking a walk in my own neighborhood." His words carried weight. The badge had already spoken, but hearing the explanation from his own mouth sealed the truth. The officers straightened their posture, their shoulders relaxing as respect replaced suspicion. Then, something powerful happened. One of the senior officers, a man with gray hair who had seen decades on the force, stepped forward. He looked Marcus in the eye, then raised his hand in a salute. It was a gesture of recognition not just for his position, but for the calm and dignity he had shown in the face of unfair suspicion. The other officers followed, nodding respectfully. In a matter of seconds, the energy shifted completely. What had begun as a near confrontation turned into a moment of solidarity, a moment where the badge shone brighter than any misunderstanding. Marcus returned the salute, though his face remained thoughtful. He accepted their respect, but inside he knew the deeper meaning of what had just happened. If he had not been a fellow officer, if he had not carried that badge, the scene might have ended very differently. The neighbors watching felt the shift too. The flashing lights no longer looked like danger, they looked like a reminder. A reminder of how quickly judgment could change the story of someone's life. One child, standing beside his father on a front lawn, whispered, "Dad, why did they salute him?" The father bent down and explained quietly, "Because he's a police officer too." They realized he's one of them. The child nodded, though his eyes stayed wide, trying to process what it all meant. Meanwhile, Linda quietly stepped back into her house. She closed the door softly, as if hoping no one noticed. But of course, everyone had noticed. Her call had brought all of this. Her assumptions had led to sirens, flashing lights, and nearly a dangerous mistake. Now, with the truth revealed, embarrassment clung to her like a shadow. Marcus picked up his coffee cup again and gave a polite nod to the officers. "Thank you for responding," he said simply. His tone carried no anger, only professionalism. He understood that they had acted on the information they were given. But the information itself had been poisoned by assumption. The senior officer sighed softly, almost as if he wanted to say more but couldn't find the right words. "We appreciate how you handled this," he said. Not everyone could have kept so calm. Marcus gave a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Calm is the only thing that keeps situations like this from going the wrong way," he said quietly. The officers nodded, understanding more than what his words said. They began to disperse, returning to their vehicles, radios buzzing with new calls waiting for them elsewhere. The flashing lights started to fade one by one, until the street slowly began to look normal again. But the neighborhood itself was not the same. People had seen everything. They had seen how fast suspicion turned into action, and how close their neighbor had come to being treated like a stranger in his own home. They had seen how a badge had changed the story in just 42 seconds. Marcus walked slowly back toward his house, coffee cup in hand, shoulders still squared. His mind replayed the moment over and over, not because of fear, but because of what it meant. He thought about his daughter's recital, about how he would smile for her and cheer as if nothing had happened. But he also knew he would carry this moment with him for a long time. To everyone else, it might just look like a misunderstanding that ended well. But to Marcus, it was proof of something deeper. Proof of how fragile trust could be. Proof of how quickly assumptions could place a person's life on a thin line. And proof of how a simple salute could carry both respect and irony. As he reached his front porch, he paused and looked back at the now quiet street. The sun was still shining, the birds had returned to the fences, and children would soon be outside again. To anyone who had just arrived, it would look like an ordinary neighborhood on an ordinary Saturday morning. But for those who had seen it unfold, it was a story they would not forget. A story of judgment, recognition, and the thin divide between suspicion and respect. And for Marcus, it was a reminder, one more chapter in a life that demanded strength, patience, and an endless amount of calm. The flashing lights had gone, and the last patrol car turned out of the neighborhood. The street slowly began to look normal again, but the memory of what had just happened lingered in the air like a shadow. Curtains that had been pulled aside to watch now closed quietly, though the people behind them were still talking, still replaying the dramatic scene in their minds. Marcus stood quietly on his porch for a moment. He looked down at his half-empty coffee cup, the warmth of the drink almost gone. His eyes moved across the street where Linda's porch light was still on, though the woman herself had disappeared inside. He knew she was the reason this had happened, but he felt no anger toward her. What he felt was heavier than anger. It was disappointment. He thought about how quickly everything had escalated, how, in less than a minute, his peaceful morning had turned into a moment that could have gone terribly wrong. He had done nothing unusual, nothing threatening. He was simply a man walking in his own neighborhood, carrying what he was trained and required to carry. Yet, to someone else's eyes, that had looked like danger. As Marcus stood there, a few neighbors began to slowly come out of their houses. Some came over, pretending to check their mailboxes or sweep their porches, but it was clear they wanted to see him. A middle-aged man from 2 doors down gave him a small nod. "Hey Marcus, everything okay?" Marcus offered a faint smile. "Yeah, everything's fine now," he replied calmly. The neighbor hesitated, then added, "Saw the lights, saw the officers, looked serious." Marcus shrugged lightly, as if to ease the tension. "Misunderstanding. Someone thought I was a threat." The man frowned but didn't ask more. He knew what Marcus meant, even if he didn't say it directly. With another nod, he turned back toward his house, but not before glancing toward Linda's porch with a knowing look. Inside her home, Linda sat near the window, peeking through the blinds. Her heart was still beating quickly. She told herself she had only been trying to protect the neighborhood, that she had done what any responsible person should do. But deep inside, she knew she had acted too quickly, too harshly. The image of the officers saluting Marcus replayed in her mind, making her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Marcus, meanwhile, went inside to prepare for the rest of his day. He had a recital to attend, and he refused to let this morning ruin his daughter's special moment. He placed his coffee cup in the sink, washed his hands, and changed into a fresh shirt. As he buttoned it, he caught his reflection in the mirror. For a moment, he just stared at himself. His badge sat on the dresser, gleaming in the sunlight. That badge had saved him, but it shouldn't have had to. Later that afternoon, Marcus sat in a crowded school auditorium, clapping as children took turns performing on stage. His daughter walked up, her small hands shaking as she sat at the piano. When she looked up and saw her father smiling proudly at her, her nerves seemed to vanish. She pressed the keys with confidence, filling the room with sweet music. Marcus clapped the loudest when she finished, cheering with pride. For that short time, he let himself feel only joy. He didn't think about the morning, or about the way his life had been put under suspicion. He thought only about his daughter, about how far she had come, and about how important it was for her to see him there. But once the recital ended and the family returned home, the weight of the morning settled back in. His wife asked quietly, "Are you okay? You've been quiet since we left the school." Marcus nodded slowly. "I'm fine. Just thinking." She gave him a soft look, the kind that came from years of understanding. "It's not fair," she said gently. Marcus sighed. "Fair or not, it happened. What matters is how we move forward." That night, when the house grew quiet and everyone went to bed, Marcus sat on the porch again. The air was cooler, and the stars were scattered across the sky. He thought about the salute he had received from his fellow officers. It had been a moment of respect, but also a moment filled with irony. They had saluted him because of the badge, but what if he hadn't had it with him? Would the story have ended the same way? The thought stayed with him, heavy and unavoidable. He knew that as much as the salute had shown respect, it had also revealed the fragile line he lived on every day. Meanwhile, around the neighborhood, people were still talking. The story spread from one house to another, retold in living rooms and over backyard fences. Some neighbors defended Marcus strongly, saying he was a good man, a respected officer, and that the whole situation had been unfair. Others whispered that maybe Linda had overreacted, that she should have thought before making that call. By the next morning, the event was the main topic at the local coffee shop. A few residents who had been there described how quickly everything had changed, how Marcus had shown his badge, and how the officers had saluted him. The story spread like wildfire, gaining more weight with every retelling. For Marcus, though, it wasn't about gossip or whispers. It was about the lesson. He carried himself with dignity because he knew that one wrong move could have cost him more than embarrassment, it could have cost him his life. And he couldn't stop thinking about how easily it could happen to someone else who didn't carry a badge. In the days that followed, Marcus continued with his routine. He went to work, came home to his family, and lived his life as he always did. But he noticed small changes around the neighborhood. Some neighbors greeted him with warmer smiles, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of newfound respect. Others avoided his eyes, uncomfortable with the truth they had witnessed. And Linda? She kept to herself. Her once frequent complaints about lawns or parking suddenly stopped. She no longer lingered on her porch, watching the street like a guard. She avoided Marcus entirely, though she often thought about knocking on his door to apologize. But pride, mixed with shame, kept her silent. Marcus didn't need her apology. He wasn't looking for it. What he wanted was something bigger: understanding, fairness, and a world where his presence wouldn't be seen as a threat before it was seen as human. One evening, as he tucked his daughter into bed, she asked innocently, "Daddy, why were there so many police cars at our house the other day?" Marcus paused. He looked into her young eyes, so full of trust and curiosity. He smiled softly, choosing his words carefully. "It was just a mistake, sweetheart. But it's all okay now." She nodded, satisfied with the answer, and soon drifted off to sleep. Marcus sat beside her for a while longer, watching her breathe peacefully. He promised himself that he would keep teaching her about patience, kindness, and strength. He wanted her to grow up knowing the importance of fairness, even in a world that sometimes struggled to give it. The memory of that morning would not fade quickly. For Marcus, for his family, for his neighbors, it had become a story that would linger. A story of fear, recognition, and the power of perception. A story that showed how quickly life could shift in just 42 seconds. And as he sat quietly in the dark, Marcus knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only a turning point, one that would stay with him forever. Days turned into weeks, and the morning when police cars filled Marcus's street slowly began to fade into memory for most of the neighborhood. But for Marcus, the moment stayed with him like a quiet echo he couldn't ignore. No matter how normal the days felt afterward, he carried the weight of that morning in his heart. It was not just about himself. It was about what it represented: how quickly fear could paint a man as dangerous, and how fragile peace could be, even in his own home. Marcus went on with his life as he always did. He woke up early for work, kissed his daughter before school, and greeted his wife with warmth at the end of long shifts. To anyone looking from the outside, he seemed steady, calm, and unchanged. But when the house grew quiet at night, his thoughts often drifted back to the flashing lights, the raised voices, and the way the officers had saluted him after realizing their mistake. His daughter, still too young to understand the depth of what had happened, sometimes asked innocent questions. "Daddy, why did the police come here that morning?" she would ask, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. Marcus always gave her a gentle answer: "It was just a mix-up, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about." He wanted to protect her from the heaviness of the truth for as long as he could. Childhood was short, and he wanted hers to be full of trust and joy, not fear and suspicion. The neighborhood, however, had not completely forgotten. Whispers still floated when people gathered. Some neighbors had become kinder, offering Marcus warmer greetings and even small gestures of friendship. One elderly woman baked a pie and left it on his porch with a note that read, "For you and your family, thank you for all you do." Marcus appreciated the kindness, though he knew it came from a place of quiet guilt. Others remained silent. Some avoided eye contact, their unease showing in the way they crossed the street a little earlier or quickly turned away when he walked past. He didn't take it personally. He had learned long ago that silence often came from people who didn't know how to face the truth. And then there was Linda. The woman whose call had started it all kept to herself. Her once loud voice in community meetings grew quiet. She no longer stood on her porch watching every detail of the street. Her mailbox was checked quickly, her trash bins taken out at night when fewer people could see her. She carried the weight of what she had done, though she never came to Marcus to speak directly. Marcus sometimes saw her from a distance. Their eyes would meet for a brief second, and she would quickly look away. He could see the shame in her face, but he didn't chase her for an apology. In his heart, he believed that true change didn't come from words alone, it came from reflection, from learning, and from doing better in the future. At work, Marcus shared the story with a few close colleagues. They listened carefully, shaking their heads at the thought of one of their own being treated with suspicion in his own neighborhood. "Man, if that can happen to you," one officer said quietly, "it can happen to anyone." Marcus nodded. "That's the point," he replied. "It's bigger than me. My badge saved me that morning, but what about the people who don't have one? What about the ones who don't get those 42 seconds to prove themselves?" The room grew quiet after his words. His colleagues knew the truth of it. They had seen similar situations before, though not as close to home as this. The story spread among the department, not as gossip, but as a reminder of how important patience, fairness, and clear judgment were in their line of work. Back in the neighborhood, life slowly returned to normal routines. Children played in the park again, dogs barked from backyards, and sprinklers sprayed across green lawns. But underneath the surface, there was a new awareness. The morning with the sirens had left a mark. It had reminded everyone how quickly assumptions could become action, and how dangerous those assumptions could be. Marcus used the experience as a lesson, not only for himself but for those around him. When he spoke at local youth events, he didn't tell the full story with names and details, but he shared the heart of it. He told young people about the importance of staying calm in tense situations, about showing respect even when it wasn't given in return, and about the power of patience in moments of misunderstanding. His words carried weight, because they came from someone who had lived it. One evening, a young boy from the neighborhood approached him shyly. "Mr. Marcus," he said softly, "my mom said you're really brave. Is that true?" Marcus smiled warmly, kneeling to meet the boy's eyes. "Being brave doesn't always mean fighting," he explained. "Sometimes it means staying calm when it's hard to. Sometimes it means choosing patience over anger." The boy nodded, though he didn't fully understand yet. But the seed was planted. For Marcus, the true victory was not in the salute he received, but in the lesson he carried forward. He knew that moments like the one he had lived through could not be erased, but they could be used to teach, to remind, and to inspire change. As weeks turned into months, the story became less of a daily conversation and more of a quiet memory. But for Marcus, it remained as clear as the day it happened. He never forgot the sight of his neighbors watching from their windows, the sound of sirens filling the air, or the look on the officers' faces when they realized the truth. He also never forgot the silence that followed, the silence that carried both relief and unspoken questions. One night, as he sat on his porch under the stars, Marcus thought about everything he had been through in his life. He thought about the challenges of being a black man in a world that often judged first and asked questions later. He thought about the strength it took to wear his badge with pride, knowing that it protected him in some moments but also painted a target in others. And he thought about his family, the reason he woke up each day ready to face whatever came. The night was quiet, broken only by the sound of crickets. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. He reminded himself that peace was something worth protecting, even when it was fragile. And in that moment, Marcus made a silent promise to himself. He would not let the morning define him as a victim of fear. He would define it as a story of strength, patience, and truth. He would carry it with dignity, not bitterness. And he would use it to remind others both in his community and in his work that fairness and understanding were more powerful than judgment and suspicion. The memory of those 42 seconds, when his life shifted from danger to respect, would stay with him forever. But he would not let it weigh him down. Instead, he would let it lift him higher, guiding him to be a voice of calm in a world that too often rushed to fear. As he finally stood and went inside to join his family, Marcus knew the story was not just his own. It belonged to everyone who had seen it, everyone who had felt it, and everyone who would hear it in the years to come. And though the world outside still carried its struggles, inside his home there was warmth, love, and peace. That was what mattered most. That was what kept him moving forward.